In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. As we light our third Advent candle, let's just spend a few moments handing over to God every situation, concern, or worry that requires God's presence, God's light to shine into it, the light that is the light of hope and love. Good morning and welcome to our third Sunday in Advent talk. It is Sunday the 13th of December and it's great to be with you even if it is virtually, and I'll see some more of you. Obviously this is particularly for those who are shielding at the moment, but I'll see the rest of you in church later when we can light that Advent candle together. Now our text today, or our texts, the main one is Matthew 2 verse 23. We've also got 1 Samuel 23, 7 to 29, and Isaiah 53. But if you just want to read Matthew 2, 23, that can just set you up. When I was 11, I played left back for the Church Lads Brigade football team. We were a bit of a rubbishy old outfit. We had been for many, many years. Every single year we came to play in these East Midlands qualifiers. If you got through these East Midlands qualifiers, you go on to play in the national competitions and eventually reach a final in London if you were good enough. We'd never in the whole of our history got even close to that until this one year, my 11th year. Suddenly a few things came together. We had a group of schoolboy players in our team who were better than average. We'd never had so many together. And we also had a really inspirational leader, a chap called Martin Raybould. He was the kind of person, wasn't just inspirational, but he was really encouraging, nurturing, and he helped this group of skilled individuals actually play as a team. Now, I'm not including myself as one of those skilled individuals. I was just one of those who helped make up the numbers. But when you're playing around really good people, it makes you look all right, doesn't it? So there we were. We shocked ourselves by making it through those East Midland qualifiers that we were playing in Leicester. We found ourselves playing in the All Midlands heat. We got through there and we were flabbergasted to find ourselves on the bus on the M1 driving down to London to this big all-weather arena. It was a bit of a logistical nightmare because we didn't have our own kit. Usually we'd sort of decide a week before to wear a similar colour top, usually just a white gym top or something, because what's the point in investing money in a squad that's basically just a bit of, it's kind of a part-time thing we did as part of our CLB. We weren't a serious team until we actually started to play okay. So we had this panic. All the parents were asked by the leaders to try and procure some kind of purplish looking tops, purple and claret being a big colour in Northampton. White shorts, well, we all had white shorts from going to gym, white socks and a pair of these all-weather trainers. Most of us only had plimsolls who were at school, so we took those. We felt quite smart in our almost matching kit. That was until we got off a bus and we saw the other teams. They were really prepared. They'd obviously done this before. Some of them had strips with special logos on their particular CLB branch. One team had the names of the players on the back. I was very jealous of those. And they all had really nice boots. We looked like poor country cousins by contrast, with our sort of cobbled together kit. We didn't look as if we belonged in this esteemed company. So we have these expectations, don't we? We have our expectations of ourselves, of other people, of how we think we should look. You wouldn't, for instance, imagine Marvel or DC Comics coming up with a 5-foot-tall, pot-bellied hero who got all his special superhero costumes from a charity shop. It just wouldn't get the fan base. People wouldn't bother writing comics about that because it doesn't fit the mould of a superhero. And the early Christians had a bit of a problem too, a PR problem. This king who they'd come to believe in and to follow, and for many of them, lay down their lives for, he didn't fit the worldly image of what God's king should look like, neither for the Gentiles or for the Jews. So they proclaimed Jesus as God's king. The first problem was that God's king came from Nazareth. Now, if Jerusalem was their equivalent to our London, the posh bits, then Nazareth was their equivalent to, say, somewhere like Penna in Pembroke Dock. I actually think Penna's a decent place and there's some lovely houses there, but there's this reputation. Some people talk about Penna in a slightly derogatory kind of a way. And of course, you would expect the Queen or a royal person to live in London. You wouldn't expect them to have their palace based in Penna. Just doesn't fit the mould. It doesn't feel quite right, does it? So the king then, this King of Kings, who these early Christians are purporting was the answer, not only didn't he live in a palace, in a London equivalent, he didn't even have a palace. In fact, he didn't even have the ancient equivalent of a semi-detached house. In Matthew's Gospel, he famously says that the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. So what kind of a king is this? A king with no army, a king who instead has a motley assortment of fairly unsavoury characters, reformed characters, people with dodgy CVs, dodgy backgrounds. What kind of a king is this? Jesus didn't fit the bill. So 2 weeks ago, at the start of Advent, we used the ark as a symbol of Jesus, for Jesus who came at Christmas. Last week we used a tent or a tabernacle as a symbol foreshadowing Jesus. Today we have the Advent Misfit. So Jesus didn't even fit the image of a hick king from a backwards country, let alone the King of Kings that these early Christians were saying that he actually was. But this wasn't the half of it. This was a stumbling block. But one of the biggest problems they had was that this king was crucified. And perhaps because we see so many images of grand and glorious crosses dripping with silver or ornate carvings, they're beautifully done. Maybe in our context, it's hard to see just how controversial and awful looking and shameful looking a cross was to those early Gentiles, Christians, Jews. It was an awful symbol, and yet it was the symbol that was chosen to represent Christ. So in Roman society, social historians tell us, you couldn't even talk about crucifixion in polite company. It would have been a huge social faux pas. It was that shameful. In fact, it was so shameful that it was against the law to execute a Roman citizen by execution. Lots of Roman citizens were executed. They broke the law. They were pretty harsh laws. But they wouldn't execute them because it wouldn't look good on the reputation of Rome generally. if one of its citizens was crucified, killed in that way. They saved it for foreigners. They didn't mind casting shame on foreign folks. And for the Jews, crucifixion was equally unspeakable, but for kind of different reasons. They weren't squeamish. We know they weren't squeamish. One of their pet punishments for people who had blasphemed or done something else that broke their social norms was stoning to death. And you don't get much more gruesome than stoning someone to death. But they believed there was this tradition, Jewish spiritual tradition, that anyone hung on a tree was under the curse of God. And so they couldn't believe, some people couldn't get past this idea that the King of Kings, God's King, could possibly be under God's curse. And so it was a stumbling block, to say the least. A suffering king didn't fit the popular expectation. But as we're going to see in a moment, if they'd have really read their prophecies, their messianic prophecies, that wouldn't have been the issue. But they hadn't. They had read them, but they were so fixed on this worldly image of what a king should look like that they just couldn't get past it, some of them. So how did the first Christians then get across, overcome some of these reservations that people around them had? Well, many were able to look beyond the cultural bias by focusing on the life of David. Now, David is the king who we were told in the prophecies would be the root of the Messiah, of the Christ to come. He would be of his lineage. But David acts as more than just a genetical herald. He's also a type of, or a kind of prototype of what the Messiah would be like to some extent. And we certainly see that in the history before David was actually fully proclaimed king. Now, he was anointed king a long time before he came into his glory, and he had an awful lot of suffering before he got to that point. So he burst onto the public scene, he defeated Goliath, he had a period of brief popularity, but he got on the wrong side of King Saul, the first Jewish king. It was odd because it seems that Saul was very jealous of David. He felt undermined by him, even though David was actually about the most loyal of his subjects. In some ways, Saul's hatred of David was bordering on the delusional and the obsessive. But David had to go into the wilderness, literally had a number of wilderness years where he was fleeing from the wrath of King Saul, who was all out for trying to kill him. David gathered a bit of a gang of outcasts around him, people who were socially not acceptable, people who'd been outcast themselves, aliens, people without the right kind of religious CV to get into sort of the mainstream society. Very similar to the kinds of people who Jesus attracted around him. And David was on the run, and he suffered an awful lot. Now, you can almost hear in your mind's eye those first Christians explaining to their Jewish friends that Jesus shared that early experience of David. Look at the songs of lament. Look at what David went through. You say that a king can't suffer, that a king shouldn't suffer. Well, what of David? David has often been acknowledged as the greatest king in our history, the forerunner of Christ. Can't you see something in David's story that reflects on Christ's? Look at the songs of lament. If the greatest king so far could suffer in that way, then what of the ultimate king to come after? So this is why Jesus didn't come with pomp and circumstance. The prophets said that he wouldn't come with pomp and circumstance. And yet people were still looking for that. They were looking for the trappings of the glorious when this king came. They were probably looking for someone very tall, very handsome, very mighty. They got a very humble man. We'll hear more of him in a moment from Isaiah. Matthew I think points in the odd little episode which he closed his nativity story to, he points to something of what it was like for Jesus. In Matthew 2:22-23, he says, "But when Joseph heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene." Now, here's one of the problems. Nowhere in the early prophecies does it say that Jesus would come from Nazareth. So what on earth is Matthew on about? Well, most likely when Matthew uses this term Nazarene, he's using a well-known derogatory slang term for someone coming from an insignificant and despised place like Nazareth in Galilee. You might remember, if you've read your Gospels, that very early on, Philip, one of the followers of Jesus, spoke to a chap called Nathanael about, actually Nathanael in John 1:46 spoke about this Jesus he had met, this Jesus who he believed was God's man, and he came from Nazareth. And Nathanael turned to Philip and said, "Nothing good comes out of Nazareth." It was dripping with sarcasm. He couldn't possibly believe that, anything worth anything would come from a place like that. And the only way that Nathanael was able to overcome his prejudice, his bias, was meeting Jesus himself and seeing for himself something of the authority, the insights, and the godly nature of this man. But the town was never going to do it for him. Nothing good can come from Nazareth. So when Matthew talks about the prophets describing Christ as a Nazarene, he's probably referring to them suggesting that the Christ will be despised and he'll come from very humble origins. He won't seem kingly or splendid enough, in other words. Now, some commentators suggest there's a good chance that Matthew's thinking of the David story too, that like David, the smallest of his brothers, the least kingly looking of his brothers, he came from a nowhere town. Jesus too came from a nowhere town. So instead of undermining his claim, I think it's arguable that the humble origins of Jesus reinforce his claim to be God's man, God's Messiah. Another solution to the problem of presenting this king to both Gentiles and Jews for those early Christians was to look at Isaiah. The prophet Isaiah spoke of a suffering servant. He actually wrote 4 suffering servant songs in that very long book of Isaiah. It spans about 100 years. Sometimes the suffering servant is portrayed as a nation, the nation of Israel, that would be like a light to the Gentiles. And other times in his suffering servant songs, it's presented as an individual who will turn people back to their God, who would actually embody the light. Matthew quotes the first servant song in its entirety in Matthew 12:18-21. And we see evidence there of Jesus' miracles also pointing to him as being the servant of the Lord. But the key thing is that the servant is a suffering servant. And this, I think, is made explicit in the final servant song. Isaiah 53 verse 3. And you can't not help the song of Handel's Messiah chorus coming through here. He was despised and rejected by mankind, says Isaiah. This will be your king. This will be a sign that he is who he says he is. He will be despised and rejected. And so the rejection of Jesus is one of many things, I'm only touching on a few here, that confirm him as God's man. But the point is not just that the servant suffers. The point is that the servant rescues God's people by suffering in their place. His sufferings are not accidental, they're not incidental, they're absolutely central to his mission. And Isaiah gives us his mission statement literally 700 years before Jesus came. In Isaiah 53, 4-6, we read, "Surely he took up our pain, he bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are all healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." From Isaiah's perspective, looking ahead, and some of the descriptions that Isaiah gives of the crucifixion are like that of an eyewitness. But we see through that lens ahead of time that the crucifixion wasn't some sad anticlimax. It was actually Christ's crowning glory, a paradoxical coming into his kingly inheritance, his crowning, that crown of thorns, that humiliation that the Romans were heaping on Jesus was unwittingly the crown they were placing on his head, was part of God's plan to express this suffering man, this God-man, before the whole world. Somebody wrote recently that Christmas in our culture is often about presents and parties, family and food. In the process, Jesus is often pushed to the margins of his own birthday celebrations. Well, there's nothing new to this. Jesus has always been marginalised by the world, but it doesn't mean he's not the real thing. When we turned up at that football tournament all those years ago, we looked ragtagged, we looked like we didn't belong, and yet we got through to the semi-finals that year. We proved we belonged by our performance on the field. We were real contenders, and Jesus doesn't look like a real worldly king, but he did what was necessary. As Isaiah said he would, he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. And this is what it took to save his subjects from death. And one day he's going to return, and we're told in Scripture that every knee will bow. There'll be no doubt when he returns. The cloak of suffering will be shed, and Christ will come into his glory, into his new fulfilled life that we can join. So be encouraged. Don't look for Christ in the big, the splendid, in the wonderfully religious. Look for him in the face of the poor, the oppressed, the despised. We can live out our faith most faithfully according to Scripture, not by going to church. Not that I'm suggesting we don't go to church. It's a great strengthener. But the ultimate expression of our faith is in how we deal with those people. It's in serving those at the margins, in our attitudes, in our hospitality, in our love. And as we saw in Matthew 25 in that talk just before Advent, God takes personally how we treat other people. And how we treat other people is one way that we can give homage directly to the suffering servant, the King of Kings, Messiah.